Well, a very warm welcome, first of all, from myself, Monica Bohm-Duchin. As a few of you may perhaps know, I was the initiator and now the director of the Insiders Outsiders project, which was a nationwide year-long live arts festival that took place from March 2019 to March 2020, expressly to celebrate, but also to look in a more nuanced and indeed also comprehensive way at the tremendously rich and diverse contribution made by refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to this country's culture. And of course, COVID rather brutally sort of curtailed the festival. Luckily, you know, in March, it was already about to come to an end. But it's also given the whole project an unexpectedly rich afterlife in the form of online events such as this one. And it's actually been a wonderful experience for me to see how there's been the potential for so many more events. And one of the things I've been very, very keen to do as part of this is to give members of the so-called second generation and indeed the third generation, in the case of Maya here, a chance to tell their stories, to show how in many cases they have themselves creatively engaged with their complex family experiences and are indeed in the process trying to find out more about their parents, grandparents, or whoever. So lovely. If I could just, sorry, let me just admit a few latecomers here. A few practical matters. I'm sure you all know the ropes ad nauseum by now. If you could all make sure that you are in fact muted and stay muted, you'll have a chance to ask questions, in fact, at any point through the chat function. If you could make sure that the questions and comments are addressed to me, to Monica Bohm-Duchin, rather than to everyone, so that we don't distract Maya as she's talking, or indeed anybody else, that would be appreciated. And also the event will be recorded, so if you don't want to be seen, never mind heard, you might want to turn off your cameras. I'll tell you more about where you can find the recording towards the end. Lovely. So very good. Let me now introduce our speaker. Maya is, as I'm sure most of you already know, she's the granddaughter of the artist Dante Elsner, who will be the main focus of her talk today. She's a writer born in London, and her debut poetry collection, very serendipitously, called Overrun by Wild Boars, an intriguing title, Maya, is forthcoming with a publishing house called Flipped Eye, almost exactly a month from now, in July 2021. And I'm thinking and hoping, Maya, that you will indeed be reading one or two poems, yes, am I right, from the collection. It's a body of work that explores, in her own words, the nature of intergenerational memory in the context of trauma and gestures towards healing through the possibilities of hope. Her poems have already appeared, though, in many international publications, British, Canadian, Irish and American journals, and her work has also been widely anthologized, including in Field Notes and Survival, Live Canon 2020 anthology, and Crossing Lines, an anthology of immigrant poetry, all published in the last year. So you've clearly been busy and increasingly successful, which is lovely to know. Very good. So without further ado, welcome to all of you. Welcome to Maya. Maya, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm so moved and honoured that you have taken time out of your busy Monday, especially on this beautiful warm day, to hear me talk about my grandfather. And thank you so much, Monica. Thank you to Insiders Outsiders for giving me this platform. It's the first time I speak publicly about my grandfather, and I think the first time that anyone in my family speaks publicly, so it's a big deal for me. So thank you, all of you, for being here. I'm going to screen share to show some images and to show a PowerPoint. So just bear with me while I'm not brilliant at the technology. Okay.
Perfect.
So my grandfather was a painter and a potter. And I think the really important thing to kind of begin with and to take with us, I guess, is that he is a person who managed somehow to find a way to continue living and making and celebrating life after he had lived the complete destruction of everything that he knew and the complete, killing of all of his family member. And I think this was a daily task not to fall into despair, a daily task not to give in to desperation and to hopelessness. And through art, there was a real search and journey into finding a place that was more hopeful, that could celebrate all the joys that life can give, and find a way to see something that goes beyond the hopelessness that sometimes really threatens us. And I think thinking back to this past year, which is a year that has been so full of isolation and of loneliness and of tragedy and also of grief, it feels important to think back and to bear witness to people who have had, I guess, at the core of their practice and life practice as well as creative practice, a question about how do we get up in the morning, and how do we find a way to carry on, and how do we kind of bear witness, I guess, to all the losses and grief that we have lived, and find a more positive way to be. So here I begin. My grandfather, because of what he lived in the war, he was mistrustful of all authorities and institutions. So he didn't show his work to anyone, and it's all, oh, can I go down? Yeah, it's all basically stored in my parents' house. So in this kind of garage to the left is where all the pots are. You can see they are stored in kind of 20p plastic boxes from IKEA. I think this one is from the 90s. And kind of, we don't really know what's in them. They're all in kind of bubble wrap, and every act of unpacking is an act of discovery, an act of kind of what is going to be inside this box. So there, a friend took a picture of me unpacking one of the pots. And here you see them all stored. And I think, you know, it's basically impossible to get to the back of this garage, and it's basically impossible to get to the bottom, you know, the back row at the bottom. It would require bringing everything out, and there is little space. I'm glad that you can't see the spider webs of the garage in this picture. But I think a core kind of part of this question is that, you know, I'm here partly because I was going to go to America last August, to do a master's in creative writing. But because of all the disruption, because of everything that was going on, because of Trump's attitude towards international students and to universities, I was unable to get a visa. And so have basically had this year to kind of begin to think about what we do with all this stuff. So here the paintings are stored in the back of my parents' house. And it's a really significant work that my grandfather has left behind. It is thousands of pots and hundreds of mounted paintings, hundreds of drawings, hundreds of sketches. But again, that nobody knows about. He's a virtually completely unknown person. So I think a big question that is kind of underlying this is, how many generations does it take away from the event to speak about it? How much distance before we can even begin to think about the archive as something that is multi-layered and emotional, to think about kind of bringing those boxes out and unpacking them, both in a kind of literal sense and also kind of an emotional figurative sense as well. And I just put these two paintings together. I think the one on the left, what it really speaks to me is this question of what are the stories that we all carry? You know, as a writer, I'm always interested in storytelling, but this question of, in contexts where so much has been destroyed, perhaps your whole cities, languages, people, through our stories, what we carry are the landscapes and the mountains and the river, the stories of survival, and how there is almost like sometimes a obsessive need to retell those stories, because when everything has been destroyed, sometimes stories are the only thing you have to make sure something survives, to hold on to something that maybe no longer exists in the current context that is being lived. And then on the right, I wanted to put this picture here because for me, it speaks also to the illegibility sometimes of those narratives, that actually, you know, the gap between what is said and what is understood sometimes is, it's hard to bridge that gap, and sometimes things come out fragmented. They come out in kind of weird shapes and sizes, and I think, and also that certain things that are lived in one cultural context or one linguistic context are not necessarily comprehensible across the generations. And I think one thing that I really think about a lot is just this question of memory, how many silences exist, but also how in contexts of trauma, where often what happens is you are stuck in a moment reliving it, there is a real inability to make narratives, because narratives are in some way things that make sense of something, right? There's a beginning, middle, and end. There is a drive towards some sort of thing, which is this thing called destination. And I think one thing that really strikes me about my grandparents is that they were not very able to make stories. They weren't able to give that kind of like teleology that gives the sense of why, because some things kind of completely disrupt our sense of why things happen, I guess. So I'm going to give you a chronology. One thing I need to say before I start is that the majority of these paintings are done in the 60s and onwards. So when my grandfather is already in Britain as a refugee, and almost all of them are not kind of illustrations of his life. So I have chosen pictures and I have linked them with kind of certain events in his life, but I want to be really clear that this is my own imposition, and it may be that he would have completely disagreed with me. But let me start now with the chronology, which is that he was born in 1920 in Krakow in Poland. Poland as a country had just been reunited after more than a century under kind of split between the old empires of Russia, Austro-Hungary, and Germany. So it was a time of kind of boom of the nation state. He grew up between Krakow and Lvov, which was at that point in Eastern Poland. And then after the Second World War and the redrawing of borders, it's now in Ukraine. And they lived between those two places because my grandfather's father was an engineer in the oil fields, which were near Lvov. And my grandfather was sent to school in Krakow when he was 12 to live with his grandmother, because the family had aspirations for him to be a doctor. But in 1938, when he was 18 and he finished school, there was a quota for Jews to study medicine, and the quota was 0. So he couldn't study medicine, and he began with biology with a view to changing the year after to study medicine. But of course, the year after, 1939, the Second World War broke out with the joint invasion of Poland by the Nazi army from the west and the Soviet army from the east. My grandfather fled Krakow to the east where his family were. There are a series of stories from that moment he was actually informed on the train away from Krakow by someone who identified him as Jewish. And an officer turned up to their compartment, their carriage in the train, and actually took an immediate dislike to another man who was kind of shorter in stature, and told him to remove his coat to show the yellow armband, which kind of identified people as Jewish, and the other man wasn't wearing one, and the officer then accused him of basically not wearing the armband. And the informant told the officer that he had identified correctly, because of course, to say that it had been the wrong person, that actually this informant had been talking about my grandfather, would be to kind of suggest, it would seem as if he was trying to hide a Jewish person. So I guess the beginning of the war, Krakow falls in 6 days, they surrender without a fight, is this time of mass dislocation of people, mass migration of people trying to get to the eastern side of Poland, and a chaos of informants, of people watching each other, of very small scrapes with death. There was another moment in which a German officer ordered people to the left and to the right. This happened a few times. My grandfather was ordered randomly to the right. We don't know why. Everyone on the left was shot in front of those on the right. This is a kind of classic fear tactic. It was used a lot in the gas chambers, in the concentration camps, for people basically randomly decided whether you would go straight to the gas chambers or whether you would be sent first to do forced labor. Because my great-grandfather's father was an important engineer in the oil fields, the family were not deported to the depths of Siberia and Kazakhstan, as many Polish Jews were in Russian-occupied Poland between 1939 and 1941. This meant that the family comes under German occupation when the Nazis break the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1941 and invade Russia. My grandfather at this time in 1941, after the Germans come in, is working as a manual laborer with his brother Richard. And one day in 1942 in September, my grandfather basically refuses to go to work, and he has a big argument with his father because his father is very kind of, you know, has an attitude, is very into discipline. You know, you don't just shirk work. He was kind of educated in Vienna. He had this very Germanic view of hard work. So they have this huge argument. And that's the day that Bruno, my grandfather's father, and his brother Richard are taken away, and they are never seen again. They die in the death camp in Sobibor. My grandfather flees with his mother Cecilia. The day that evening, when he realizes that they're not coming home, and they make the mistake, they go to Lvov, the big city, they make the mistake of taking a room next to the station. But this is, of course, in a context where everyone is watching the railway, everyone is watching who is coming, who is not coming, and they do not have papers. So the next day, my grandfather goes to buy bread, and he comes back to find the room ransacked and his mother betrayed, and later finds out that she dies in Belzec at the death camp there. So in 1942, at 22 years old, my grandfather has lost in 2 days his immediate family. And when my father was 22 in London in the 80s, he came downstairs downstairs in the family home that was a kind of fortress with bars on the windows and padlocks on doors. And the first thing my grandfather said to him was, "This is the year where all my family were murdered." So that was a good happy birthday for my father at age 22. I show this painting because of the title. So my grandfather doesn't kind of really paint in ways that are excessively personal, actually usually not personal at all. But in the context of his huge argument with his father, the day the father and brother are killed, I thought it was worth showing here. He held my forearm and we said goodbye to each other, Don Juan. So my grandfather, have I muted myself? No. So my grandfather then is all alone in the world, and oh dear, sorry. He goes to the forest to hide. So here are some paintings. Again, these are not specific to this period. These are made many years later in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But here you have fear, and here you have learning to stay afloat amidst the flood. My grandfather sometimes joins up with groups of people, but there is huge risk in doing so. The group is dangerous because you do not know whether you can rely on everyone. And so what we know from this period is that this is during this time where he basically develops what he later called as an animal instinct to know whether there was any human being near. And he also eats snails to survive. He had heard that the French ate snails as a delicacy, and therefore, you know, that they were safe. And he lives for 2 years in the forest. We did ask him later for more kind of stories, and he did share some, but others he said were too terrible to dwell in. And if he began to tell the entire story, then he would have to tell everything, and there were some things that he was never going to tell. So I wanted to show some paintings that I think show a certain degree of struggle or difficulty. So here you see on the right with my wild horse, on the left a human being. This is a painting on the left that I come back to a lot. I think there is a interesting ambiguity about whether that kind of woman's face is the external mask hiding a more menacing figure within. And I think in context of, you know, the betrayal of his mother to her death, and also in the kind of inability to trust the people around you, you can see that kind of interpretation. But equally valid would be just that both exist within us, you know, simultaneously, the kind of maybe more violent impulses, and also what is capable of generosity and kindness and the rest of it. Here you see on the left what kind of appears to me as some sort of interpretation of the upside downness of life. And I guess, again, in context of trauma, when you live something that completely shatters your any idea of what is a norm, and then things just, you know, get back to what they were before, people just go on. I think that can be a really alienating experience that kind of dislocates you from everyone else. And then on the right hierarchy, you see the person who has been kicked, who then becomes the aggressor, the persecutor. And this one, this is actually about Iraq, the first invasion, the first Iraq war. You do what I want or else. You see a man shooting a machine gun. So after the war, in 1945, my grandfather enrolls in art school. He no longer has, you know, he doesn't know anyone anymore. All his friends are dead, his family are dead, there is no need to become a doctor. And so these paintings, you can see they're very different from the ones I've shown. They're not actually from his time in Poland, they're from his time in Paris. They're some of the earliest works that we have. And you can see a lot of it's oil painting on canvas. You can see on the left around the border, he's used kind of scrapes of wood, and it's very abstract, very colourful. And he described this moment as this incredible moment where the young people just threw themselves into making, trying desperately to account for lost time, but also trying to make sense of the worlds that they'd lived. And I think that the teachers were quite old-fashioned, but this was a period of incredible energy. But my grandfather had absolutely no love for Soviet occupation, for Soviet rule, after what he had lived between 1939 and 1941 in Soviet-occupied Poland. So in 1948, he applies for a visa to kind of go to Paris to continue his study. And as soon as he's in Paris, he immediately seeks asylum, and he never goes back to Poland. So this is his painting, Paris 1951. It's actually behind me. And this is a really desperate time for him. He doesn't know anyone. He lives alone in an attic room with no running water and no heating. In winter, it's absolutely freezing. In summer, it's baking hot. He eats in a soup kitchen for the very poor and for the homeless. He does odd jobs to kind of try and find a way to make a living. And everything he spends on materials, and he kind of paints on his vests when he runs out of canvas. And one day, kind of when he is in a moment, I guess, of extreme despair, he goes to the Louvre, which is, you know, as he really wanted to kind of continue his craft, continue his learning. So he would always go to museums to try and learn from the works of the past. So he goes to the Louvre and he comes across a picture of Hendrickje Stoffels by Rembrandt. So it's the one on the left. And he sees this woman and he sees what is in her face, which I think for him, you know, was this sense of actually kind of serenity and goodness. And he later says basically that this painting saves his life, because he sees the love with which Rembrandt has painted this woman, has given this woman's face such a sense of character, and realizes that the fact that art can communicate to a viewer years later, hundreds of years later, that is enough to make you continue, make you kind of live on. So he says that because of this painting, he didn't kill himself that day, which is something that I find kind of quite extraordinary, that, you know, you can connect with an artwork at a moment of incredible vulnerability, and it really can have that extraordinary power. I also just wanted to share this painting on the right. Hendrickje Stoffels is also the muse. It's also by Rembrandt. This is it's a picture my grandfather really loved. And this is a painting of a story in the Old Testament where basically King David is really lusts after Bathsheba, the woman in the picture. And he lusts after her so much that he sends her husband to the front line in a battle and he is killed. So this painting, and you can kind of see why maybe my grandfather loved it so much, in her hand is the letter that tells her that her husband has died. And I think the interesting part of this painting is, although, you know, she is naked and it could be an extremely erotic picture, it's actually a picture about the intimacy between these two women in a moment, and you can see her face in which she has found out this terrible thing. And you can see the kind of red ribbon that dangles down her neck. That draws you towards her face and not to her body. So I think it was a very important picture, I think, for my grandfather. And now I just want to share with you a poem I wrote that was published last year about this moment in which my grandfather decides that, you know, not to kill himself, not to take his own life, despite everything, despite what he has lived. My grandfather and Rembrandt's Hendrickje Stoffels. Soft eyes to the lost boy gazing, her hand poised gently, fingertips resting. You in the Louvre, seeking asylum. Poland ravaged. Cecilia taken, Renata, the Russians reframing as liberation another takeover. The Paris soup kitchens are full of Jews and PTSD. Suddenly such intimacy. The artist painting the beloved's image, the yellowing of her hair, spilling out, and my grandfather seeks an end to suffering. These echoing absences. Arthur, the superstitious engineer, and Eva with a laugh like sunrise, and Janek, suddenly an anchor in ripples, brush strokes spraying the sides, a reason to survive this oyster world as swans skim the imaginary pool, hopeful for a paper transformation or the little reassurances amnesia brings to eyes brimming water as morning weeps. What I have to say, I'm sorry, I should have said it before, is that characters that you don't know about are actually from my grandmother's story. She was also a Holocaust survivor who lived in Poland during the war. So in this frame, I have kind of conflated people from both of their lives. I wanted to unite them in this poem. So here is another painting from his time in Paris. You can see the influence from Cubism. Again, they're very colorful. It's oil on canvas. Paris is a really important time for my grandfather. He's here between 1948 and 1958. And it's partly he has access suddenly to the incredible rich collections of the Parisian state museums, which just are not available in Poland. And he also comes into contact with the spiritual teachings of the Russian mystic and teacher and philosopher George Gurdjieff, and develops his very particular philosophy on life and art, which is a series of kind of daily meditations and exercises that are an attempt to integrate mind and feeling and intellect and body in order to kind of sharpen perception, to receive impressions, and impressions are a very Gurdjieffian word. He really believed that the artist was not an ego-driven subject, but was rather a vessel to receive what life might have to offer, and then to render it through kind of the perfecting of artistic skill onto the page. And I think much of his work with Gurdjieff was an attempt to kind of fine-tune perception, to see beyond the base impulses that are maybe more easy in society, the kinds of violences, and see something that is more positive and more hopeful. In 1958, he marries my grandmother. He meets them through a Polish Jewish couple who run a soup kitchen, and he comes to London first as a refugee and then eventually is naturalized as a citizen when he marries her. And I think beyond their shared circumstances, so I've said before that they were both born in Krakow, they both survived the war in Poland. My grandmother had a different war experience. She was 8 when the war broke out, and I think, you know, whether you're a child and an adult is relevant in terms of how trauma affects you. But they both had together they shared a reaction against the kind of hyper-industrialization and materialism of post-war society. And I think, you know, I've just included some more funny pictures. My grandfather was very satirical about kind of society's pretensions and the business class, the middle class. So here you see a picture humorously entitled "A Cigar" of a man in a pinstripe suit walking, and there you see in the clouds the fantasy that he has of this naked woman. And there you have the connoisseur, where all the pretensions of learning and, you know, education, whatever, are reduced to basically this rather disgusting guy with a magnifying glass pinned up against a picture of a nude. And then to the left, I show a picture, the prison of the rational mind. I think because my grandfather was entirely convinced that it was his gut instinct that had enabled his survival during the war. It had told him to, you know, run when he met up with groups of people and later found out that they had died, they had been found. It told him all sorts of things. He was very, and my grandmother was as well, kind of really dismissive of the kind of hyper rationalization that is divorced from anything more embodied. And it's during this moment where my grandfather basically stops painting in oil because he believes that oil painting is a form of lying, because he basically kind of, with oils, you can go back to something, you can retouch it, you can change it, you can take paint away, you can add to it. Even if you've used really dark colors, you can put white or yellow or all these kinds of things. It's difficult to know whether, you know, what is the relationship between this and kind of his war experience, whether there is something about the inability to go back to change what was. But he starts painting with Japanese, on Japanese mulberry paper, with ink and watercolor, which is, and the paper is really unforgiving. So each stroke, that's the end, you know, you do it once. And so it has to be, every stroke is the kind of final intention of the artist, spontaneous, embodied, tactile between the, you know, the hand and the page. And so I think it was kind of much more in line with what he was doing in his Gurdjieffian practice, which was this embodiment of mind and body. Sorry, integration of mind and body. So on the left, this is a Buddhist story. The Buddha turns to his disciples and he shows a flower and doesn't say anything. And only one disciple, Kasyapa, smiles. And then the Buddha says to his disciples, "I transmit to you my silent teaching." So here you have his showing a flower. Do I understand? A question about whether whether he sees beyond, I guess, that primary level of experience. And there on the right, you have a Taoist butterfly. Am I a man dreaming to be a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming to be a man? So here I just wanted to give a sense of some of his subjects. You have on the right, you know, you can see the influences of mindfulness, of meditation, just to be here in this simple flower arrangement. In the middle, a moment of grace, it is what it is. And then on the left, this painting that is quite dear to me because of the title, "Just to Survive Today, I Paint These Bold Flowers." I think my grandfather was really against the kind of voyeuristic interest in the Holocaust that happened immediately after the war, and doesn't paint it. Almost never paints horrific experiences of suffering. Sometimes he paints, he also doesn't shy away from it. Like, he has a lot of paintings that are on difficult or violent subjects, but always there's this impulse to see kind of a multiplicity, to not dwell in the horror, to move towards something that maybe is more hopeful, in the hope of also transmitting to a viewer some of, you know, what it was that stopped him killing himself. And I think that is really core to my grandfather's work. So here are just some examples, I guess, of what I've said. So on the left and on the right, you have these, you know, beautiful blossoms, life and spring. And yet underneath the blossom, you have on the left this sad, suffering man. I've given you the title. And on the right, you have a man threatening another with a knife, or about to kill the other person. And I guess in both these pictures, there is a question of is it possible to look up? Is it possible to move towards the blossom, or not? You know, how human misery sits alongside the beautiful. And I think these pictures are quite kind of illustrative of his very particular sensibility. And here in the middle, I find this quite a humorous picture and also a hopeful picture, because on the one hand you see the snail, which is obviously an important thing for him, given that snails are what enabled him to survive in the forest, and you have the inevitability of the boot coming down to crush the snail, which you can see in relation to his paintings, for instance, Hierarchy that I showed earlier, where the man who has been kicked becomes the perpetrator. But on the other hand, this is just an aspect of life. It is not all aspects of life. And I think the title itself gives the sense that maybe there is also another way. There are other possibilities, and perhaps we may be able to reach them. So my grandfather, when he's in London, continues his practice of going to museums almost every day, and he goes and stays with one object for an hour or two. So this is his favorite object in the British Museum, this statue from Egypt from the 5th dynasty. And my grandfather really believed that these objects, sculptures, artworks, paintings, whatever, were active agents of spiritual teaching within their own traditions. And in viewing, one could actually learn some of the spiritual teachings that were embodied in these objects. So what you have on the right is not his picture of the sculpture, but rather his picture of someone who looks at the sculpture and in looking takes on some of the attributes, some of the inherent essence that the statue has. And I think this is, in a way, this is his kind of real philosophy on art, that actually through the act of viewing, we could become enriched and transformed. And this is his philosophy because that is what he lived through, kind of viewing this picture of Hendrickje Stoffels and imbibing from her the hope that Rembrandt had put into the picture. So here is another example, also a very important loved object from my grandfather, Tara, from Sri Lanka, 8th century. And here you see next to her a person who has become transformed through the act of looking. But my grandfather believed that you had to be, you couldn't just look. There were, it was a very particular kind of interaction with these objects that he loved. So he described it as you had to go as a pilgrim to a holy shrine. These objects were holy shrines. And he also compared the act of viewing when you went as a pilgrim to being equivalent to the resurrection of Lazarus, that you could come back from the dead. You could be restored to yourself, because these works were essential teachers of something that was beyond the ordinary, that was beyond the materialism of life. So in 1959, my grandparents have their first child, and unfortunately and very tragically, 2 years later, she dies. And I think it's difficult to tell what effect this has on my grandfather, but obviously he has lost everyone in the war, and now in the very early years of his married life, he's 37 when he moves to London and marries my grandmother, and then in the very early years his life is again has this tragic event. And I wanted to show this picture. It's called Kurdish Tragedy. Obviously there's also kind of Madonna and child influences, and you can also see with the way the baby is, it also looks like a Pietà. I don't know to what extent Anne, the baby girl who died, is also in this picture. He was, as I said, not explicit about the personal side of his art. And then I also wanted to just give this kind of rather more humorous humorous and humanist image. Out of fear, man invented God, then reassured, he fell asleep. And I think, when we think about kind of who is sleeping when terrible things happen, whether we wake, do we wake in time, do we turn away? I think these were all kind of quite big themes for my grandfather. Do we intervene? How do we intervene? Do we intervene soon enough? Or do we just sleep through as tragedy happens, as it does every day? So my grandfather also painted, sketched from life. So these are really quick sketches done in Queen's Park, actually, which was near where he lived. He also went to London Zoo, and he also spent a lot of time on the first floor landing of Willesden Library, sketching the bustle below. And he would usually paint people from behind, just because I don't think he liked being looked at. So here are some of the sketches. This is just like felt tip or whatever the equivalent of felt tip was then, on paper and with some watercolor. And here again are some figures in Queen's Park, kind of some friends, and then the woman with the child. And here, obviously, the painting from behind is also for animals. And here are some more, the tigers in the zoo, and I think it's an antelope. So in the 60s, two huge things, transformative things happen for my grandparents, for my grandfather. One is that they both, my grandfather and my grandmother, receive a pension from the German government as reparation for their personal losses, and also specifically for their loss of ill health during the war. And this pension is it's very modest, but it is payable until death without being taxed. And it is enough to live on for people who never leave the house, essentially, and who don't, go out for dinner, don't have holidays, all the rest of it. But it does enable my grandfather to then devote himself full time and properly to his kind of creative side. And then during this moment, he also starts experimenting with making pots. So here I've just chosen some pots that kind of are in color, kind of similar to the one that's in the image. So he uses both raku and stoneware. The stoneware pot in this picture is on the right, so you can see how really he uses the clay as a painter. He really paints on them. And with stoneware, what you basically do is you put the glaze on, you put it in the kiln, it's fired at around 1,500 degrees, and then it comes out and you see what you get. So it's very much a kind of like hands-off process. Raku, which is the technique that was originally developed for the Japanese tea ceremony, is completely different. And my grandfather actually makes his own raku kiln, which he installs in the garden, which is probably completely illegal. He does all of the kind of electrics himself. And with raku, you have an individual kiln. The potter uses tongs to put the clay into the kiln, decides when to take it out, and then plunges the pot into a reducing agent. So it's usually either wood shavings or grass or straw. And depending on how long the pot is in the fire, is in this reducing agent, which takes oxygen away from the glaze, which then creates a chemical reaction that changes the color. All of those things change the nature of the pot. They change the color of the glaze. And then the potter decides when to plunge the pot into the water. So it's a really fiddly, difficult process. It requires, it basically means each pot is completely unique because it is the result of a series of instantaneous, spontaneous decisions taken in the moment. Even if you were to create the same shape of pot, if you were to measure it, and if you were to use the same color, it's basically virtually impossible to have exactly the same pot because it would require you to have exactly the right amount of time, exactly the right amount of whatever reducing agent, and all the rest of it. So my grandfather leans towards this very difficult process. He sees it much more in line with the process of living Zen, and much more in line with his painting on this mulberry paper, where each stroke has to be the embodied final thought of the artist. So here are just some images of different examples of pots. The one that looks a bit like a bird that is red and white and green at the very top, and the square one where you can also see kind of, it looks a bit like a landscape with some trees or maybe some figures or writing. And then the teapot, those are stoneware, the rest are raku. And you can see they're all quite different. Some are very delicate, some are very sculptural, some have been kind of beaten, some have been carved into. And my grandfather believes that each pot is really an embodiment, or every great pot is an embodiment of experience, a whole embodiment of a particular experience, whether it is summer or joy or rain or sadness. So here are just some more examples. Raku pots, these are all raku, the ones on this picture, on this slide. Raku are incredibly fragile because of the way that they've been fired, and also because the clay that itself, which is includes a lot of grog. So you can't really do very much with them. You can't eat your cereal in them. And I think this uselessness was something that also appealed to my grandfather, the way that they are, and he kind of does that explicitly with cutting segments out of these pots. So here are just some more images that are slightly bigger, another raku pot, and here's another. So in 1992, my grandfather paints the only painting that looks back at his time in the war, which is why this picture is exceptional and unique within his work. The title is Homage to My Father and Brother, who in September 1942 were caught on the way to work by the SS police, packed into railway cattle trucks and delivered to gas chambers in Belzec. I think what is really notable is that this, in the end, 50 years after their death, he has focused on a moment of intimacy and not on a moment of violence. And although, you know, the boy hugging the father is his brother, and obviously was very important. My dad's second name is Richard, so he's named after the brother who died. You can also maybe see my grandfather in that boy embracing his past. In this moment, which is in 1992, it's 5 years before the death of my grandfather, and he's quite ill in the last decade of his life. But the other thing that is really important to note in this picture is actually there is an error in the title, quite a big error, which is that my grandfather's father and brother don't die in Belzec, they die in Sobibor. It is my grandfather's mother who dies in Belzec, and I think there is an interesting question about to what extent this was a deliberate mistake, or inadvertently what the result is that 50 years on from their deaths, he has united his father, his brother, and his mother in Belzec in death. 5 years before his death, he has brought them all together. In the last 25 years of his life, my grandfather becomes obsessed with dying, and specifically with dying well. And I think there is definitely a big question about the way in which the deaths of his parents, which were obviously not good deaths, they did not die well, haunted him, and his knowledge of what gift it was to others to die in a way that enabled people to make peace at the end. So he would lecture everyone about the importance of dying well. I think it was pretty unbearable for all concerned. But here, and I think he really used not only his kind of spiritual practice and all the exercises, but also the paintings themselves to explore these questions of passing. So on the left, humanity is created to permit the passage of energy between earth and heaven. And then on the right, leave this life before it leaves you. And I just want to end with a poem that I wrote. I went to Poland in October 19, I'm so confused by dates, 2020, last year. And I went to kind of retrace the places that my grandparents were in hiding. Not that much is known about my grandfather because the forests of Poland, you know, forests basically cover 80% of Poland or something like that. And in hiding, you cannot really be specific about locations, especially because towns were very dangerous, because there was always people on the lookout for who was on the run, and anyone on the run was potentially and most probably one of those people linked under the term degenerate, which, you know, basically was a direct train to one of the death camps. But for my grandmother, there is more that is known because she had fake papers. So during that time in Poland, I wrote a sequence of poems that kind of use my grandfather's paintings. They were my way of thinking about the nature of intergenerational memory, but also what it is when we don't have that much information. How do we deal with the archive? How do we deal with what we carry, the stuff we carry, which is both the physical and also the metaphorical? How do we begin to unpack all these things? So this imagines me, or goes back in time to me as a young person. My grandfather died when I was 2, and I was the first grandchild. My little brother was born, I think, 2 weeks after my grandfather died. So here we are together in a poem, in imagination, in memory. Still life in photographs, plotted on the x-axis, time. What is left of it? The vertical is a ladder to a slide. You throw me up, catch me as I come down. Later at the kiln, you show me a clay growth, the root of a new city. You and I mix soil, red for the bleeding town, brown for the buried bank. How God made us, raw and open. There is no homeland, just the skip in which we tip this cracked surface. Try again. Each night we mislay ourselves, mistake the moon for whole. Dig the ground for dandelion heads, decapitated stalks like soldiers stand. Each day they know too much. Your breath is harder now, your skin purpling. Less ink to mix, your strokes like words are frail, decisive. I will remember this, how wax lights gold into your cheeks. Thank you so much for listening. I'm so happy to take any questions, and I think my dad is also going to be here just in case there are certain things that I can't answer, and he might be able to provide a little bit more information. But thank you so much. I'm going to stop screen sharing.
And thank you so much, Maya. The comments that have been coming in will absolutely go to your head. I don't know if you can see them for yourself. Wonderfully positive responses. That was absolutely tremendous in every possible way. Now, I haven't actually had a chance. I was so intent on listening to you that I wasn't checking, as I normally do, the questions coming in, except to register the massively positive responses, as I say. So yes, do start asking more specific questions if you would like to. Wonderful. Perhaps just one very practical question just to start things off, Maya. You obviously, these are the titles that your grandfather gave the work, but in what physical form were they attached or appended to the work? Were they on the back? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, partly because part of what I've done this year is actually attach the titles to the images, because we had a series of photographs that were made. My dad's just joining us. We had a series of photographs that were made that actually didn't have titles. So it involved going through the entire archive, and the paintings themselves are really quite heavy, so that it's kind of a big work to even just begin to kind of like physically move them. And some have really brought in a lot of interesting surprises. So for instance, that painting of flowers, I thought it was just a still life. And then suddenly with that title, Just to Survive Today, I Paint These Bold Flowers, it obviously takes on a huge amount of meaning. And likewise, the simple outline of my grandfather's father and brother, I thought it was kind of a weird abstract painting that I didn't really understand. And then suddenly only through seeing these titles did I realize it was actually the only picture that he made of this moment, the only picture he made of his past. And the other thing that I think I should say about the titles, my grandfather's English was eccentric and eclectic. It was his third language. Obviously, he learned it when he was already 37. So that was really an act of, I guess, love. His wife, my grandmother, and my dad and his sister really spent a lot of time trying to massage those titles. So they're a kind of collective effort of trying to translate something into something that was understandable.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, unless actually, Jazz, maybe you'd like to.
Well, I was just going to add that the titles mattered a lot to him, and he was very influenced by a man called R.H. Blythe, who was a translator, I think a Brit who lived in Japan and translated the haikus. And he tried to make many of his titles as kind of haikus, which is, well, his English was not great, so sometimes they were ungrammatical and so on. So that's where help was demanded from my mother and myself. But he really took the titles very seriously. And I think when he painted a picture, its subject was already in his mind. It's not that the title came after the picture, but the two came together.
They're not really titles at all, are they? I mean, haiku is a much better way of identifying them. Yes, indeed. Okay, lots. Oh, goodness me, I can't keep up with it. They're flooding in now. Some quite.
I have a question.
Okay, we were suggesting you type things in, but go ahead. We won't stop.
There's this very strong idea of communication of art on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have all this art packed up in a garage. And I wonder if there was anything either explicitly or implicitly in your knowledge of him that would suggest that this unveiling in the third generation was something that he was hoping for and expected. You go for it.
Well, I think that he was very certain that it was not his job to be showing it to anyone. I don't think he even tried to do that. And he ran away from any institutional dealership, anything. As far as I know, obviously he died when I was 2. He did kind of pass the mantle on, but it has been very difficult, I think, partly because his feelings were so strong and they were so wrapped up in his experience of the war and his experience of lack of trust and also of betrayal. I did find a letter that my grandmother wrote just before she died, where she bequeathed all of this stuff to her children and basically said, it is for you to do something about this. Anyway, I'm the eldest of 4, so I guess it comes to me to do what those others cannot. I'm
sure the expectation was for us to get on with it, and I certainly have not been a great success in that expectation, although we have at least found a garage to put them in and passed it on to the next generation.
It's sometimes easier maybe to skip a generation, am I right? That, that necessary.
I think so, because I think the difficulty is that to deal with this work is dealing with it, you can't have the distance that you can have when you deal with someone you don't know, or with someone who's whom you can, as it were, imagine. You're dealing with such close things, really. I mean, in my case, obviously with my father, but that's also with my own relations with my father, with a whole series of very complicated issues which don't make it easy to be free about things, or to make, for example, any kind of commercial or financial kind of decision. It's just too complicated. Much easier, actually. I think a next generation, it's easier, probably. But maybe I'm just excusing myself.
It's complicated, to say the very least. Right. Okay, let's start with some quite sort of down to earth sorts of questions now. What language did he speak the most of, or indeed speak at home?
They spoke Polish to each other when they didn't want us to understand. They hardly spoke Polish otherwise. He did occasionally speak French, but that would be to someone who was French. And so they basically spoke English, a very peculiar form of English, with a lot of idioms that were clearly borrowed from other languages.
And an even more prosaic question about, yes, the way he earned his living before he got the pension. I mean, how did he live?
Well, he did various odd jobs here and there. So he tried, there was a period where he was kind of drawing, for animated film, each frame had to be drawn kind of very painstakingly painstakingly and with a lot of time, and there were various different things that he did.
He worked a bit in advertising. He did some models for architects. So the sorts of things that an artist would do, but he deeply despised, and really unfairly actually, any prostitution of the art. So the whole notion of a commercial artist was utterly opposed to his principles, which, given that if you're going to be an artist in the real world, is well, it's a kind of classic contradiction. But my father was and lived those contradictions, so it wasn't at all surprising in him. And very strangely, as a result of the Holocaust, he uniquely had a condition where he didn't need to work in the end.
Various questions, again, of a quite practical nature, but important ones. You know, how far have you got in that garage of yours? You know, how much more work is there to discover, I don't know if you're cataloguing it, but to put in some kind of order? And indeed, are there plans for any exhibitions, publications, etc.?
Yeah, thank you for the question. In terms of how far we've got, I haven't labeled all the paintings. I haven't even begun to look at the drawings. I don't think anyone has. In terms of the boxes of pots, we have looked at about maybe 12. Here, there are boxes even here. I don't know whether you can see, this is my living room. So the work of unpacking, the work of archiving has not even really begun. This year, I have been kind of trying to think about kind of having an exhibition, something that would share the work with people who might like it. I do think that, you know, the question of how we turn suffering and how we continue to live and how we find hope amidst the most terrible things is a really good story. So hopefully we will have some sort of exhibition in London in November. Obviously things are it's a very slow process because, as I said before, he's completely unknown. We have had some pots exhibited in the gallery called Alice Black, so you can look it up, but this is very slow process because nothing was known during his lifetime, basically.
A question about his relationship to the Parisian art world during his student years or in the immediate post-war years. Did he mix with other artists? I mean, how much do we know about his work in relation to what else was going on at the time?
It is quite a black box, that, actually. In other words, not a lot. But I mean, you know, I reveal myself terribly. Of course, I could never be an artist. I became an art historian. One day we had a colleague of mine from the Courtauld, Sarah Wilson, who was an expert actually in Paris around 1950. And she walked in and saw the painting that's over behind our backs. And she simply said, Paris 1950. Mm-hmm. So in some way, it was very typical of its time, of its zeitgeist. But you know, we knew later on. I met one or two other artists. We once went to Paris in the 80s. Where he took me to Paris to look at museums and so on, and we met one or two of his friends who from those times, but very little is known, actually. And in a sense, he left it behind him.
I was also slightly put in mind when I saw that image for the first time of an artist called Avigdor Aricha, who was in fact a child Holocaust survivor, indeed, whose life was saved apparently by his uncanny artistic ability, you know, in the camps, but who ended up in Paris. And I just wondered if you happen to know whether their paths had crossed at all.
I don't know.
Oh, it'd be interesting. Right, so many questions. It's hard to know which to come to first. A question about Dante's pottery. Was he entirely self-taught as a potter? As a ceramicist?
He studied in the Gurdjieffian work. There was a pottery kind of activity which they did in weekends, and this was actually led by a very competent professional potter called Peter O'Malley. So in a way, he was apprenticed to this man and learnt the basic skills from him. But thereafter, he was self-taught, and he certainly taught himself the whole of Raku. on his own, reading and obviously going and looking at at objects.
There's somebody else, I think, wanting to ask some questions. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself. Sorry, I need to, again, there's just so many here, having not had many to begin with. Yes, oh, it's an abbreviation. Would the person who wants to ask, was it you? Okay, go ahead, sure, hi.
I'm really sorry, I don't know why my Zoom keeps doing that. Maya, first of all, thank you for a really moving and exquisite talk. My question was about the pottery, because I was very struck by the fact that in his painting, he clearly references a number of other European movements, but gradually in his pottery, he moves towards a form that enables each piece to be completely unique, to not only, in a sense, resist any attempt at mechanical reproduction or mass production, but to then become a sort of individual utterance. And I was very struck by the opening image you used, which is of a figure howling or crying, really. So the urge to communicate, but something that perhaps can't be communicated or is too painful to communicate. And then through the pottery coming to a point where all these individual moments of communication can be produced that really can't be reproduced, but that are very beautiful in themselves. And of course, to me, that's a huge triumph over Nazism, because it reduced people to ciphers, to numbers, to stereotypes, it reduced individuals to some kind of notional group identity, which of course didn't exist. So it's not really a question, but I suppose I'm really interested in how you see that trajectory in Dante's work.
Could I just add to that? Thank you very much. Actually, Maya, if you just bear with me, there's an interesting observation from somebody called Amy Brown, I think, apropos the pottery, which might tie into what's just been said. Your description of the raku, the forms you showed, which sometimes seem precarious, such as the yellowish one poised on one point, the instantaneous decisions that have to be made in taking the work out of the kiln and then processing it, all these important decisions that have to be instantaneous, metaphors perhaps for what he thought of his difficulties in surviving his early life, in early life, and that of the others in his family. Or is that making too much of the parallels? I suspect it is, but it's an interesting thought, isn't it? I've noticed there's a comment from somebody called Anna Pasakis. Thank you so much, Maya. Your grandfather was my mentor when I was your age. A beautiful presentation. I learned a lot about his life during the war. I hope to meet you sometime. But I wonder, Anna, whether, given that you knew Dante, whether you'd like to say something. I don't want to put you on the spot, but please do unmute yourself and make yourself visible if you would like to say something.
Hi.
Hello.
Yes, I knew Dante. He was a very dear friend. And when I was very young, I lived in London for a couple of years and I actually learned a great deal from him. I wanted to say something about his life in Paris. I actually have a record of a little bit about his life from his very good friend, Polish artist Janina Kraupe-Świdecka. So I should send it to you guys because, you know.
Please, we don't have anything, so it would be amazing to read that. Thank you, Anna.
Wonderful. I'll put the two of you in direct touch with each other with very great pleasure indeed. What about the studies?
I was just going to say something in relation to the comments of the pots, which is I'm not sure about the question of precarity, although it's a really interesting observation in relation to the precarity of forms. What I do think is that I do think that he very intentionally wanted to make things that were beautiful, that were life-affirming, rather than staying with the war. So in relation to, I think, was it Sue who said something about kind of a resistance against what the Nazis had done in terms of homogenizing and wishing to eradicate a whole group of people. And I don't know whether you can quite say it's a kind of act of reparation, but I think that it was his act of great resistance to not dwell in desperation and to despair and to move towards something you know, and to almost not let what had happened to him define him forever, and to do something that might offer to other people some of the kind of hope that was in the end what saved his life. So I think there was actually a forward looking and sharing part of it, which he was unable to do because of his experiences. And I guess that's why I feel quite strongly that I, you know, have to do that work that he was unable to, and that my dad has been unable to do also.
I mean, I might just add one thing. I think that each pot or painting was for him a kind of living being, a complete being, and that means that it should be spontaneous, and also the question of the precarious, of the dangerous, is part of what it is to be alive. It's what, so it goes with that, and that of course is also true of the war, and also and that of all human experiences, and it isn't in opposition to a kind of mechanized rote sort of living where everything is identical. And I'm sure he would have hated anything to do with the internet and Zoom and the rest of it, but fortunately that wasn't given to him. Otherwise he would have railed and railed. It would have been amusing for a bit.
We've got a question here about the Polish years. Did he ever speak about why he left Soviet-occupied Poland? And then a comment on the back of that: there seems to be such an extended meditation on exile in his work, but also on gratitude as a form of perception.
Do you want to? I think he really didn't like the communism. The being forced to think in a particular way, he was just anathema. So he found it not much better than the previous regime, although obviously less dangerous directly, at least initially. He just hated all that. So the first moment he could get out, I think the early moment in Poland, before, let's say, 1950, communism was not yet completely established. It was quite flexible, and there was lots of possibility for creativity. But by about 1950, socialist realism became the only way you could paint or be an artist, and so on. So everything was scripted in ways he absolutely detested. Sorry, what was the second part? There was another part of that question.
It was more of an observation. I can certainly repeat it if I yes. There seems to be such an extended meditation on exile in his work, but also perhaps on gratitude as a form of perception.
Yeah, I think he did definitely believe in gratitude. I'm not sure how consciously he thought about exile, but it is very present.
I think also kind of what I was actually thinking about this morning is that there are only 4 paintings that are kind of really specifically dated in terms of date and locality. So these are his responses to political events that happened. And I think it's striking in the fact that there are only 4 plus the one of his father and grandfather. 2 out of the 4 are commentaries specifically on occupied territory and the brutality that comes in an occupied context in war. And 3 out of the 4 are specifically around racism and in kind of different contexts. So in terms of meditation on exile, I also think that is kind of interestingly notable in terms of, you know, it's most of his work is very generalized in terms of titles. And these are obviously kind of instances where he felt like it was very important to take a stand against these particular forms of violence.
Apropos violence, there's another interesting comment apropos the techniques he used in ceramics from Rotem Lineal, is it? Raku is a particularly violent process, more so than traditional kiln fire, as most of us will be aware. Not to overread this material process, but the use of burning organic matter, the risk of ruining pots, similar to the watercolor, and the high stakes one-off nature of the work, and the possibility of beauty and singularity emerging out of the fire seems very in line with the reading of his worldview that you suggested, Maya. I think that's absolutely right, isn't it?
Yeah, and just to add, he destroyed the pots that he felt weren't an authentic manifestation of a particular experience. I think he destroyed more or less 85% of what he made. And I think my dad and him, they used to draw drive around London trying to find skips to dump the stuff because they wouldn't be taken away. So it was this undercover operation to kind of get rid of these shards. But I think that is interesting in terms of well, the sheer quantity of what he made, but also the search towards something that was, you know, that was a creation of this integration of mind and body and feeling. So anything that was disparate, that had maybe too much intellect. And when he looked at other kind of, you know, artists, he was kind of very, the works of art he loved most were the ones in which he perceived had this entire integration of all these elements, not the ones that were kind of maybe too cerebral. He thought analysis killed art, and killed most things.
I think the destructive side is interesting also with the paintings. The thing about that Japanese paper is that it commits you to quite a high price per sheet. I can't remember, it's £1 or something, but it's a lot of money to him at least. And every act of painting is a destruction. You can't reuse that sheet. You could cut out the white bit and use it as a small drawing later on, but once you've done it, you've lost it. And he might need even 100 of those before he got the painting. So there is a destructive process on both sides actually in creating something that he would then leave.
3 questions, not just one, from Michael Werner. First of all, yes, curious, I was going to ask the same. Dante, what a strange name. I mean, you know, was it his birth name, in fact?
It was, and I think it's because David was seen as too Jewish.
Right.
And he always said that his parents would have called him David, and they called him Dante, the most, you know, the classic Catholic poet, who couldn't in a way be more perfectly assimilated in, except awkwardly assimilated, so assimilated as to be hopelessly assimilated in nationalistic, newly nationalistic Poland in 1920.
Also a comment also from Michael about he was struck by the presence of Hebrew characters. Is that actually correct? And possibly motifs from Jewish communal narratives of trauma. I wonder about that. Did your grandfather say anything about this, and what do you make of it?
I think it would be unconscious.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's entirely impossible, but I don't think he would have done that consciously.
And then the third question from the same gentleman is, how would you describe, explain, or even justify to him your exhumation, as he puts it, a narration of his work? And I wanted perhaps to bring that together with a comment from Tamar Garb. For whom did he paint or make pots? Do you think, Maya, that you're his ideal viewer, especially in your role as poet and scribe?
Well, that's a bit of a hard question.
Yes.
Do you want to say something? I personally feel that the works are doing no one any good sitting in a garage and in a shed. I do know that he would have hated to be narrativized, and he would have, and you know, he himself never dated his paintings. He had a real big reaction against being boxed in, which you can completely understand why. His whole life was about hiding. So for me, I think the really big thing, I feel very sad about how isolated he was, or how I hear he was, because I think that community can be very healing, and it's often a result of trauma that we are isolated from others, and you can understand definitely from his life story. So in terms of what you were saying about exhuming his work, for me, you know, it's the act of sharing is a first step towards trying not to undo, but to hold that isolation and transform it into something else. And it's really only been through kind of conversations with my friends, who I am endlessly grateful for, and some of whom are here tonight, that I've also been able to kind of begin the process of talking about this. So in a way, thinking about how we can be isolated and also connected. I think those themes are important. And in terms of what you were saying about exhuming, I think that is one of the reasons why my dad finds it difficult to tell a story, why I have to tell the story, and why the burden to tell it properly or well or sensitively is, you know, it feels a bit like there are quite high stakes. but it also feels like this is a way to give back to him something of what he lost in relation to his ability to trust that the world was anything other than dangerous and violent, given that he was wholly convinced that the Holocaust would happen again. And the reason for lack of trust in anyone else was that you could never believe, when push came to shove, and it inevitably would come, that people wouldn't betray. And that is a very sad thing to believe utterly, totally, and deeply in all your interactions.
I mean, I think it was because art was a way of life and a kind of spiritual practice. It was very difficult for him then to reconcile it to anything commercial, to dealers, and he was terrible. He was terrible. I mean, actually, poor people. I mean, why should they be condemned for trying to make a living? But that was not a possible attitude from his point of view. You know, that was a problem. I think also, so I think he firmly and fully believed in the value of his work, and that it would have a life afterwards, and it was my job to do it. That's a different matter. But I think, so I think he would have been happy for it to be exhumed, as it were, for it to be brought to being, but that wasn't, he did not see that as any part of his role.
I'm not sure that exhumation is quite the right word, is it? I think, you know, the use of the word share rather seems to me much more apposite and, you know, appropriate indeed. A short but poignant question, just apropos what you've been saying. At what moments was Dante at his happiest? Did anything make him happy? Was it not the actual making, the creative process itself, perhaps?
Definitely the creative process. And I mean, he could be very happy, very genial, jovial. He was happy in conversation, particularly with younger people, actually. He could be very difficult. Indeed, he could be totally impossible, particularly with authority and things like that. But any kind of great art would make him happy, actually. And he had quite a wide range of sense of what that might be. It was, you know, anything that represented, as it were, a struggle and an inner development in the artist that could be communicated. That at least, you know, and it's that sense of communication, something that is made, known, given a sufficient form, then to be transmitted. That's real.
Which other artists did he talk about? I mean, you've obviously, you know, Rembrandt is up there, as for so many Jewish artists, incidentally, but who else did he admire?
I was going to say this, actually, yes, in response to Tamar's question. The other thing is, he was a hopeless, classic, modernist romantic about what an artist was. So he went to Paris and lived in a garret for 10 years, starving. That's what artists do and should do. The idea of, you know, the Damien Hirst of this world, that would be anathema to him. You know, artists ought to starve. It's a principle. And likewise, great artists, Van Gogh, Cézanne, whatever, they may never sell a thing in their lifetime, but then they will be found. This is an obvious truth. And it may not be an obvious truth to everybody else, but that really didn't matter to him. So in terms of artists he admired within the Western canon, actually many of the ones we would call classic, but he would be able to give you a reason why, for example, looking at any particular, I don't know, Velázquez or Goya or Rembrandt, why particularly that painting or that way of doing it, by comparison with the painting next door. He would compare, for example, Vermeer with Peter de Hoogh or one of those. He could be very, very precise about showing you what it was that really represented a seeing of the world in a different way in the hands of that artist. I would have thought the last truly great artist from his point of view would have been Cézanne. He thought Picasso and Dali and so on were geniuses, but were squandering themselves on rubbish most of the time. And that was partly their subject matter and partly the glibness of whatever. He had a great love of the British studio pottery scene. It's something that he landed into and, of course, in a sense, worked his way into. Particularly Hamada, not quite British, but semi-British, and then Bernard Leach, I think was his favorite. But he had a soft spot for both Hans Koper and Lucy Ree, who were, of course, refugee artists from the same, broadly the same context as he was.
I'm also put in mind of a potter who's much less well known, called Janet Haigh, who's still alive today and producing some wonderfully physical, rugged artifacts in ceramics. And there's actually a filmed interview with her on the homepage of the Insiders Outsiders website, which you might like to look at and others might like to check out as well. Gosh, so many questions. I'm looking at the time and thinking it's probably time to start rounding things off. But perhaps just one or two last questions. Given his evolving spiritual practices, to what extent did Dante consider himself Jewish?
Interesting question. Ambivalently, but definitively. So, you know, I mean, you couldn't take all the Holocaust, the whole lot, the whole package can't be taken away. And as I suppose many people of my generation remember, however dismissive he might have been of anything to do with Jews and Jewishness, and certainly we weren't a Jewish household, wait till there was one of the Israeli wars and everybody would be, you know, there was hysteria around. So it complicated. He had a great love of the Jewish spiritual tradition, Hasidic tradition, the Hasidic stories, Martin Buber, all that world, and actually great respect for it. So quite definitively so, but in other ways, absolutely obsessed with making an appearance of not being Jewish. And that's to do, I think, with the Holocaust, to be honest. That's to do with the conviction that the persecution would return. You know, they moved into a house where there were mezuzahs on the door. That is to say, that it was a Jewish house. He took them out because nobody's going to see, because if there are mezuzahs on the door, then they come and smash the windows. It'll happen. And that was I think a clear certainty. When I first grew a beard, he wanted me to shave it off because that would mean I would be beaten up. And when I almost got contact lenses, he told me that that's a really bad idea because when they beat you up, you lose your eye.
Yeah.
If your glasses are knocked off, no, it won't matter. So I never wore contact lenses.
Wow. Okay, well, as I say, we could continue, and indeed there are some questions we haven't got time for. I'm just perhaps going to take the privilege of rounding this off, because there is a question that's actually addressed to me rather than to you, but obviously ties in with this wonderful session we've just all been experiencing. To what extent does Dante's life illustrate the premises of your exhibition? It wasn't actually an exhibition, it was much more than an exhibition. It was a whole festival involving many different events, but I think absolutely this feeling that you have traumatic experiences, and obviously this is the case also for refugees who got out in time, that there's a profound backdrop of loss and dislocation and trauma, you know, which to some extent might fuel their achievements in the post-war period, but particularly when you're talking about those who went through the hell and worse of the Holocaust, it's even more the case. And of course, those are much fewer in number than those who came as refugees in the 30s for historical reasons to this country. But I can think of a number of others who have actually featured in the Insiders Outsiders project. Naomi Blake, for example, a sculptress who emerged from the horror with a tremendously profound feeling of the need to rebuild bridges, to to foster relations between all human beings, whatever their faith and creed. And that all sounds terribly cliched, but you know, it was a heartfelt feeling that comes out in the work itself. A feeling that creativity is undoubtedly not a panacea, certainly not, but a way of making some sense of grappling with and giving expression to those dark and deep experiences, I think is absolutely universal. And that's what I personally find so inspiring. And also a sense of living, not necessarily for the moment, but actually saying, well, yes, I did survive, so I am going to make something of my life. I'm going to defy the death and perhaps the death wish to make something that will last into the future. And I think that's, you know, it sounds again rather pompous, but I think that is, if one had to generalize about what so many of the remarkable individuals that have come under the aegis of my project all have in common, that would be it. But you know, your presentation is, you know, absolutely the supreme example of it. And well, what can I say? Thank you so much. I'm sure if we were all in a proper space together, you would have resounding applause. Absolutely. It was a wonderful presentation. I think there are more thanks coming in. And Maya, I will send you, as you know, you can get a transcript, a copy of all this chat, and I'll make sure that you're connected with anybody you would like to be connected with. Good. And just last but not least, to repeat, it's been recorded. Give us a week or so, perhaps even less. And it will appear on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. And what I didn't add before is that actually we've been having so many of these wonderfully intimate talks by family members engaging in one way or another with their precursors' experiences, that we've actually just created a new section on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel called, I think we called it Second Generation and Third Generation Voices. So, you know, if you're particularly interested in that aspect of things, that's the place to look. But there are many other things besides. Good. Maya, thank you very much. Jazz, thank you for being prepared to talk as well. Thank everybody for being here. And maybe see you again, but keep in touch one way or another. And Maya, I'm sure that we will keep in touch. And good luck with your own publishing venture. I would have loved to know more about your own feelings of being a poet vis-a-vis your grandfather, but let's leave it at that for the moment. And let me know, you know, when there's an exhibition, a publication about Dante's work, and I will help spread the word. Good.
Thank you.
All the very best, everyone, and good night. Be well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.